Hello, good afternoon and good morning for some of you. Welcome to today's webinar with the Why Zoos and Aquariums Matter project. I'm Melissa Ballard. I'm the Communications and Community Manager at CASE, which stands for the Center for Advancement of Informal Science Education. We are a project of the Association of Science Technology Centers and based in Washington, D.C. All right, next slide, please. And then one more. All right, so now I'm going to hand it off to our presenters to introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about where they work and their experience in the field.
I'm Johnny from New Knowledge Organization, ecologist and an architect. Joe, you're up.
I'm Joe Heimlich. I'm Joe Heimlich. I'm Director of Research at COSI at the Center of Research and Evaluation, I think.
My name is Martin Storksteg. I direct the Center for Research on Lifelong STEM Learning at Oregon State University, and I'm a professor there in the College of Education.
So we're going to turn off our cameras now, since you know we're actually live people, and we'll be voices in the background for a minute or two. So our agenda, as we said, for the folks who didn't join us last time, we are going to do a short recap and the first 5 minutes, just to catch you up to the larger framework for the project. In the former webinar, we spent a little bit more time talking about the methods and theory. This agenda is focused on the findings, and you'll see they're somewhat enigmatic titles: bring and take, do and take, assign and integrate, which we'll be explaining as we go. And then we're going to end that with some questions and answers. Sorry, I'm just going to slide something around here. There we go. So our project is asking the question, what are the real outcomes of the zoo or aquarium enterprise, both as a visitor destination and as a social actor? So we are looking not only at the visit, which has tended to be one way of focusing on where learning occurs, to look at how an institutional voice exists within society and how it compares to other types of institutions. We break that down based on the partners' focus. So we're a collaboration here. There are the 5 entities or 6 entities that are working on this project. So you've heard there are 3 presenters here today. Each of us is representing a different kind of question, from New Knowledge, from the Center for Research and Evaluation at COSI, and Oregon State University Center for Research on Lifelong Learning. We are doing this as a research to practice project with the Association of Zoos and Aquariums as a key partner. And for those of you who are with Zoos and Aquariums who are on this call, I expect a lot of you are already participating in this. We have over 100 participating organizations, as well as the association, involved in the project. Our evaluators are the Garibay Group, and the curriculum and professional training tools are being developed by Jessica Sickler. We have our NSF disclaimer at the bottom so that you know that it is funded through 2 grants, and we do thank NSF for that work. We'll come back and thank them in a little bit. The overarching frame for this project, though, is to think holistically about how a cultural institution like a zoo or an aquarium and the entire sector works in society. So we have the individual, their experience that can occur both inside and beyond their experience at the institution, the context that surrounds that experience, and then the social narratives, or how people interact with the idea of that institution in society. So we've broken those down into a series of behaviors that you'll see are secret words. The what do people bring with them? What do they do during their visit? What do they take away? How do they integrate that into their life? And then how does that inform what they believe the cultural institution can and should do, its authority and its legitimacy? And we've divided the projects up with Oregon State University, looking at that physical individual, what people do, what they take away, with the Center for Research and Evaluation, looking at the narratives, what people bring, what is that contextual input, and how does that influence what they take away. And then lastly, the New Knowledge work is focused on the understanding the organizational voice, both how people integrate the experience after, and what that means about bias, preconceptions, or authority assigned to an institution to speak to the STEM topic. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Joe Heimlich, and we'll let him take over for a little bit to talk about the work they've been doing with Bring and Take.
Thanks, Johnny. So basically, we are looking at what people bring to the visit in terms of their knowledge, motivation, interest, background, experiences, and the like, and then explore those and what they take away from the visit regarding the conservation messages espoused by the various institutions. Focusing on what visitors do, bring and take, LLG collaborated with 25 zoos and aquariums to collect data via an online questionnaire from visitors. We synchronized data collection in order to limit external variables as much as possible, and collaborators collected data during typical daytime operating hours. We have data from those zoos and aquariums who collected it in winter, spring, summer, and fall. So basically, we're now entering our data analysis section, and we're looking at what people bring in terms of all of those things, those complex aspects that make a person a person. We're going to zip through some of the high-level preliminary findings. These are based on only the first 2 seasons of data collection, so we know numbers and proportions will shift somewhat, but some of the patterns we're beginning to see are likely to remain. And because this is so preliminary, we're not going to go critically into numbers, but let you get a sense of the very simplest of the findings that we have. So how do people define themselves when they visit the aquarium or zoo? Would this be the same for your facility? Well, finding much of what we believe to be true is on target, but not all. And the slide did not progress. I apologize. Yeah, this is what were different for your facilities, and is it what you would predict? Visitors find zoos and aquariums highly trustworthy. Interestingly, their feelings towards wildlife is muddier, with only moderately strong positive feelings compared to these very, very strong trustworthiness measures. We feel it is important to know how much our visitors see us and in what ways they see us as scientific institutions, and do they trust the science we provide. So people think the purpose of a zoo is 1, to take care of its animals, 2, educate and connect people to wildlife, and 3, be actively involved in wildlife conservation. For aquariums, the purpose is 1, educate and connect people to wildlife, 2, to take care of its animals, and 3, to provide pleasure and enjoyment. For both, providing economic and cultural benefits was rated lowest, but the mean for this scale was between 6.29 and 6.40 on a 7-point scale. So people very strongly feel that the zoos take care of them. So how do your visitors view the purpose of your institution? How much do they align their value of the visit to the values that you want them to have? How do people then experience their visit? People feel comfortable at the aquarium or zoo. They connect being there with good times. They have fond memories of good times at the zoo or aquarium with the family and friends. They feel they can get away from their everyday stresses at both aquariums and zoos, and that they can restore their connection with the natural world at the aquarium. Further, they feel they can exercise or be active at the zoo. How do people truly experience their visit is what we're trying to determine so that we can better understand how we shape the messages we give. So regarding an overall of the demographic, the median number in a group was between 3 and 4. The majority of visitors were in groups of 3 or less. Visitors are generally well educated, with 47.5% having college degrees and only 2% having no diploma. Visitors tend to be Gen X and baby boomers, 78.5%, mostly female, 71%. A slight majority of them are suburban, 54.4%. Urban and rural are almost identical percentages as of the summer and winter visitors. Visitor demographics give us a good sense of who people are, but they don't tell us the deeper part of what we want to enhance in our educational programming. The top thing people wanted to do during their visit will be compared to what they do during their visit. So in the preliminary findings, these are the top 3 entry and exit items. You'll note that spending time and doing something fun dropped from the entry list and didn't show up on the exit. Very likely this is because these are entry values people hold, and once an expectation for a value benefit is met, it's often not as important as then the experience itself. So more on this once we see what the full data will tell us. What did people learn? Well, are visitors getting the basics, or are you engaging them at a deeper level? How are your important issues being shared? Here's the order of topics where people felt they gained the most. Slightly lower positive responses were toward how to decrease use of plastics, how to practice water conservation, about global climate change, how to practice energy conservation, and sustainable shopping. So a little lower on the more specific content, but very much on the broader messages. People felt they spent their days in a beautiful setting, having the type of experience they wanted. There we go. People felt they spent their days in a beautiful setting, having the type of experience they wanted, seeing animals they don't usually see, and affirming their care for the environment and feeling their love for animals reinforced. People got from it the things we want. The visit to the zoo engaged them physically, mentally, and to a lesser degree, spiritually. However, the plurality of respondents feel nature is spiritual or sacred in itself, while a somewhat lower number felt nature is sacred because it's created by a higher power. What are the questions your museum is asking about religiosity and beliefs? What is science? What is God? What are the implications then for how we share messages? We are also learning things about career stage, employment level of engagement of employment, hobbies, and by the way, food is the universal hobby or activity people seem to enjoy most. Political position, 18% liberal to 22% moderate and 18% conservative, with then some outliers on the very liberal and progressives and some outliers on the conservative or libertarian. We're finding out if they donate to other conservation organizations, how often they visit a national or state park, about their exercise level, about who makes decisions during a visit, and then how often they visit the zoo or aquarium, and how much time they spent during their visit. So, are there any quick questions?
Okay, so we have one question, a general question, and I'll just answer it. So I think a couple of you asked, where can some of these results be found? Why Zoos and Aquariums Matter does have a project website, which we just put in the chat box, so you can check there for some regular updates, and their publications are there as well. A second question that we have from an audience member, someone asked, what theoretical framework are you using when you're analyzing your results?
It depends on the scale that we constructed. The theoretical framework varies based on the type of question we were asking, and we did a lot of digging in the literature around different ways of getting towards some of these different aspects of life stage or social role. And so basically, the underlying would be that of life stage social role as part of the context of a visit. And then that brings in all the demographics around the person. So we're trying to really contextualize the visit in the life of the visitor, as opposed to as if nothing happened to them before or after the visit, that they come as a whole entity. That's a tough one to answer, only because we did use some very different theories based on the structures of questions we were asking.
Great, thanks, Joe. So we didn't have any questions at the moment, but just so everyone knows, after each presenter, we'll pause for audience questions, and we'll also have time at the end once you've heard a little bit of all the pieces of the project that might inspire some more questions. So we'll hand it off to Martin.
Hi, thank you. Just to check, since I had to put a headset on that I didn't have before, can you hear me well?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. So we are now looking at a slightly different approach. This is the one where we ask ourselves, what do people actually do, and what does the doing have to do with what they take away? Next slide. Our research question is basically, what are the entry characteristics that also Joe's group is looking at of visitors, and how do these characteristics, who they are, what they bring, how do they play out in terms of their behaviors during a zoo and aquarium visit? And that behavior has to do not only with what they choose to attend to and for how long, but also where and in what ways are they making meaning and engage in active meaning making. Next slide. We basically have two parts in our study. One is a study that we're currently finishing in the data analysis, and one that we are starting in part 2. The first part is basically, in essence, where we track people by giving them GoPro cameras in one member of a group and record in great detail audio and video of that visit. And we then contextualize this by having an understanding of who during our data collection time at 6 different zoos and aquariums around the country, who the visitors were, by putting cameras on the entrance of these zoos and aquariums and estimating who came. The part 2 that is currently beginning is a more experimental in situ study in which we, at 2 different exhibits at 2 different sites in the country, an aquarium and a zoo, are changing the interpretation to understand whether differences in interpretation change the way in which people engage in conservation talk. Next slide. Just to give you a sense, as I said, the first part of the study was done in 6 different zoos and aquariums around the country with GoPro cameras, by people walking around, but also by putting cameras at the entrance to get a good estimate of who actually came through the door. We didn't do this because we wanted to say these are the visitors to zoos and aquariums, but to understand what the context is within which we did our study, but also to give some idea of a more in-depth way of understanding visitors in very, very broad strokes. We did this through cameras and then estimates. Next slide. When you try to understand who is coming through the door simply by looking at people when they were recorded, you can make lots of mistakes, and we were quite aware of that. So in each of the 6 sites, we did 150 intercept interviews to simply analyze and see whether check whether our estimate from just observing is relatively accurate. And what we find here is, and again, we did this not to understand who individual groups are. We did this to understand how our sample compares to who came at that point in time, and how are people who come to this point in time, is the whole group compared to, let's say, census data, so that we understand a little bit the broader sense of who is coming. And our estimates for group size and group type were fairly accurate at 95 and 96%. And when you think about why could you miss how big a group is, imagine somebody walks in who doesn't belong to the group and then splits off and you couldn't see that. A group might come in 2 waves and we get that wrong. So there's slight differences there. I was surprised, 93% for gender expression, male, female, more or less, from an estimate of what you see. You can make mistakes there. And of course, when it comes to the idea, is somebody a Caucasian or not, which is basically the race ethnicity, again, we did not do this to understand individuals, but to have comparison data with census data, let's say, same for age, the accuracy goes down. But it's still in a range in which we can say we can make some estimates. Next slide. Just briefly an overview, and there's way more in detail that you can all study in terms of who came through the door. But what we found confirms what Joe in his sample has, which is about 2/3 of the groups in our sample were visiting with children, meaning about 1/3 did not. There might have been some bias because of special conditions on one of our sites. Spring training is the term. The adult groups had a median group size of 2, meaning they come as couples, and the median age was 25 to 34. So you can think of a typical adult group as a young couple on a date. The groups with children had, surprisingly to me, a median group size of 3 and a median age of 25 to 34, again, which means it's a young family with children. I think my sense was that groups might be bigger, but that the detail, when you see the median, means there are still lots and lots of variation around this. Next slide. Just to give you a sense on why we did this, in part in order to find the bias in the visitation that Joe was already talking about. There he has, of course, more detailed data about the nature of the groups that we did not ask, like socioeconomic status, but you can see here that in our sample, we have more Caucasian, more female, slightly more, and of course, more younger children and more young adults than in the general population. And that represents just a typical visitorship to the zoo and aquarium. Next slide. The core of phase 1 was the tracking study. the idea of putting GoPro cameras on baseball caps, as you can see with this one individual here who is standing in front of an interpretive sign. The GoPro camera is on front. We had interviews with people who did this. One person in the group got both these GoPro cameras on top. They went through, and we are analyzing this data. I'll talk a little bit more about this. Average time about 2 hours, and then when they came back, we interviewed them again. And with the GoPro camera, we have the advantage of really understanding what people are talking about and what they're looking at in great detail, in ways that I think we have not seen before. And that is essential to our research questions, which is, at the end of the day, in what ways are people making, and who is making determined decisions about what people are paying attention to, and where are they making meaning, and what is the meaning making they're making? Meaning, for instance, to what degree does this include thinking about the zoos and aquariums and the animal welfare and conservation and so on and so forth, but also where does STEM come in, meaning talk about science and technology, even the engineering of zoos and aquariums and so on and so forth. Next slide. This is basically just a background slide that you can study a little later about the kinds of data that we have in these connected entry interview, observation, exit interview. I'm not going to go over this. I already mentioned this detailed data about why they came, what they think about zoos and aquariums pre and post. In post also what they and how they made decisions and what they believe they learned. And in the observation, we know pretty exactly what they're paying attention to, what the nature and of the exhibits are they're paying attention to, and how they make decisions and how they make meaning. Next slide. A quick overview of the exit and entry interviews. Here is responses to open-ended questions about what the zoos and aquariums are about. And this is extraordinarily encouraging. This is emerging codes when people openly spoke about this. And when you ask them, at least the visitors that we were intercepting, the notion that the zoo and aquarium visit is about direct encounters and interaction with animals seems to be foundational, such that one would think this is what it's about. What's really encouraging is how many go beyond that. How many see that this is a means to an end, and the end is in effect education for me. I learned something here, and the conservation component was equal to that, and in fact moved a little up at the end in the exit interviews. What's also interesting is that their first framing of what this is about is not entertainment, and despite the fact that they're probably here because they want to have a good time. Next slide. We then had them rate statements about how important these various kinds of statements are in terms of the zoo and aquarium mission. And you can see this educational experiences. We asked that they provide this, that they provide critical habitat, that they connect to that, allow us to connect to the natural world, that we have entertaining and enjoyable experiences and direct encounters with nature and wildlife, that they improve the public understanding of science, and that they are leaders in sustaining and protecting the environment. And what you see here with these extraordinarily high ratings is that when people are given a choice, they endorse these kinds of purposes for zoos and aquariums. And what we can see here is, while there are slight differences, given the number of people we have, this is basically a broad recognition that this is all the things that zoos and aquariums should be doing. When we ask them, next slide, to actually, in a more distinguishing way, to say what's really more important here, by ranking them, what surprises me here is just the degree to which people felt that zoos and aquariums are leaders in sustaining and protecting the environment, and protecting habitat, and so on and so forth. And only third came the educational experiences. So they see this as an educational institution, but they see the distinctive nature that zoos and aquariums have. Next slide. We are currently, the coding framework is only here for you later to potentially, when you look at this, have a deeper dive into what we're doing. Next slide. I want to give you one example from the tracking study. Of course, you're all interested in what happened to the meaning making and how are people making decisions. We are still in the process. We have analyzed 14 of the 70. It's very, very time consuming to go through this with a very complex coding scheme. So I want to give you a little highlight from the 14 that we have finished, which is a bon mot here is that visitors indeed engage in meaning making, not at the exhibit, but outside the exhibit as well. Not all of them, but sufficient numbers that we can say, really, this is an important thing to pay attention to when they're in transit between exhibits or when they're in a gift shop or anywhere else. So meaning making and talk about things is not just happening while they're at the exhibit. And here's an example of a child that says, what does the octopus eat? Another child answers, it eats the squid. And the mother is surprised and said, it does? And the first child says, I think, I don't know for sure. And so here's this interaction where people make meaning, they interpret something they see. This is, by the way, also an incredibly nice example for family learning, where the mother then also learns about the child, not just about the stuff. So with that, as a first little glimpse into this, I'll open up for questions. Next slide.
Great, thank you, Martin. So we have one question from an audience member who is wondering, on the visitors that you studied, did you differentiate at all if people were tourists or they were locals? Did you have any sense of if that made a difference in some of their answers and interactions?
We have that information. I cannot tell you that yet at this point in time. I think because of the I think that didn't make much of a difference. Given the high rating, for instance, you can find many differences here, but I will get back to this and an answer in our written answers to the questions and answers that we give later. But I don't think we saw much difference here.
Great, thank you. So that's all the questions we have at the moment. So we'll hand it off to John.
Thanks, Melissa. Thanks, Martin and Joe. So again, New Knowledge Organization is really focusing on the social narratives, the authority and legitimacy that is assigned to zoos and aquariums to talk about STEM topics and where they are in context. So our study design was really looking at public surveying around public narratives. What we wanted to look at was understanding how bias or assumptions are being made about the role of zoos and aquariums. So not only how people perceive these organizations, but how much, what do they think they should be doing? And then how much do they think they're currently doing? So we call it, how do you trust an organization, for example? And then how do you perceive they are performing against your level of concern? So our focus was working on what we call the moderate middle, because there is a strong bias toward zoos and aquariums, which kind of creates a wash in the data that always looks very happy and appears to be very stable. That group has not changed much over time. In the same way, there's a very small sector of the population, gets to about 4%, who it doesn't matter what you say, the zoo and aquarium is something that they do not agree with, and therefore will consistently respond the same way no matter what you ask. So we refer to the rest as the moderate middle, the folks whose opinions tend to change and tend to be more volatile. So that's where we see a lot of debate or discussion about the value of zoo. Now, what we wanted to do is look at the gap between trust. How much do you trust that a zoo, how much do you weigh the importance of, for example, the facilities having space to meet the needs of animals, that it meets the care concerns, that it has an expectation to meet the emotional needs, and then how much do you perceive is actually happening? So what we see is a difference between what I want to see, how much I would want to see to believe they're doing the right thing, and how much I perceive happening. And that's what we call the trust gap. So that's something you can just see from the slide that's on the screen, that space to meet physical needs of animals is perceived to be a higher difference between what people see and what they wish they could see versus the other categories around trust. We were also interested in exploring the ethical integrity that is expected of zoos and aquariums. So this dimension is really a category where we're focusing on the degree to which zoos are working toward that and sharing what's going on. So it's standards, it's expertise, and it's about the facilities. So this dimension of ethical integrity is really a way of understanding where people put bias or concern. The things they're going to suggest, if you're not meeting my expectation, then how can I actually listen to the stories you want to tell me about that dimension of the zoo or the conservation issue that the zoo wants to focus on. So in doing this, we explored this idea of dimensions of trust. Now that has been very common in the industrial and organizational psychology world. Industry looks at this. Brand is an example. When a company has a brand, you look at these levels of trust in order to determine how much you're willing to believe that organization is not violating your sense of trust. So we see these debates happening right now with how your data is managed by social networks like Facebook or Instagram, or frankly anything, whether it's a shoe manufacturer or a healthcare provider. People tend to look at these dimensions referred to as competence, the responsibility to inform you about a change. We see that crisis happening right now in the banking industry. Interactional courtesy is very much about my physical experience and interactions with the organization, the degree to which I don't see them playing funny with money, and then, you know, are their processes fair? Are they following the law? So these are dimensions of trust that have come out of the industrial and organizational knowledge or psychology. What we did was asked if these held true. We used similar dimensions, and we put in a number of other questions in order to determine if zoos and aquariums actually fall in the same categories. And in fact, we found they did not. The dimensions of trust that emerged in our story, procedural fairness, like, you know, when I go to the bank, are they actually treating me fairly, is not the kind of thing people were focused on here. These dimensions are slightly different. They're somewhat the same in terms of how they come out, but they're very specific. The ethics of the organization become something that is of high concern, along with what you heard both Martin and Joe talking about earlier, is that issue of telling me about what's going on with conservation. We want to see that the institution is actually doing conservation in the field, and we have an expectation that they will be activating people to do something about a problem. When you look at some of the data we get from the entry studies that you just heard about, it's very consistent with this idea of I expect the organization to be acting altruistically around conservation. I'm expecting them to teach me, not a surprise, but that breaks out into two ways, both informing me or others about what we should be doing, but also seeing these organizations as collaborators. That issue of not being part of, not a standalone organization that is prideful, but rather part of a network of organizations who are doing good. Then, of course, we get into the quality of the place and the experience. We reorganize these into four categories. The dimensions we call the ethical integrity, which we know affects how people trust an organization, their conservation agency, the degree to which they demonstrate transparency in what they do in their business, and then the quality of the organization. So each of these is like a dial, and when they're all turned up full, then we are going to likely activate a sense of trust in our audiences, in our visitors. That bias or assign, how much trust are they going to assign the organization to help me understand what I can do in conservation, is going to be affected by each of these dials. So those are the four dimensions we were looking at. In the last few months, we started looking back at our data. Now, this was based on two different studies, one that was just under 400 people when we developed the construct validity, and then a representative survey of another 1,300 people. What we started to do is look at, is there variation within this group? Because all the numbers are pretty high. You saw some of the averages, again, that Joe and Martin presented. So in our data, we looked at, is trust different? Are there different psychographic profiles? Do people have different emotional priorities or value priorities that they place? And if so, what does that mean to a zoo and aquarium? So we developed a series of trust profiles that come out of a principal components analysis of our data. What we found is that there is significant variation across types of visitors, where they're putting their priorities and what that means to what they care about. What you're seeing here, the black dots on the screen, represent the mean or the average that we see across all of our categories. We see that each of these types break out only because of how they prioritize. To the left of your screen means they care less about this topic. To the right, if you see a diamond, they care more about the topic. So we defined our core group. You'll see that the ethical integrity dimension that we were concerned with is pretty consistent across all four groups. That issue of being an ethical actor, an ethical organization, is central and consistent across how zoos and aquariums are being evaluated. The same thing with doing actual conservation work. These are the two dimensions where we see no variation in the American public. What we see interesting, though, and how our workshop with the zoo and aquarium professionals helped us name our groups based on the priorities, was the first group we called the experiencers, people who really look at the quality of what's happening when they're in the institution. They prioritize the quality. They're less interested in being advised on what they should be doing personally. So we called them the experiencers. Our second group in the second column, the conservationists, interestingly, have very low concern for the quality of the attraction. They're not as interested in, is it a quality experience, because all of their other dimensions seem to push a little more toward the conservation issues that zoos and aquariums are talking about. They do have a slight higher priority on the quality experience as well. Our third group, what we called the loyalists, were people who actually were not as interested in whether they collaborate or whether they are creating a quality experience. We thought it was quite interesting. This group seemed very loyal to the institution rather than the idea of the collective. And we said earlier that was very important when we look at the national data, but this group sort of slides a little off that question. And it means that suggests that our other groups are putting higher priority there. And lastly, our environmentalist group. Our environmentalist group cares a lot more about the quality of the experience for the individuals, but they're not as interested in what's going on with the critters in the park. Other than that, they pretty much prioritize all of their issues around environmental issues. It's not as conservation principle as much as it is environmental values. So those are the four profiles we've come up with. Now I've got one more part of our data that I want to share before we move into questions. And this is another effort in parallel. What is the STEM learning ecology? And we conducted this project by doing focus groups to understand where people place learning that happens at a zoo or an aquarium in relation to other types of institutions where STEM learning may occur in the city. And this one's going to go rather quickly. It's a bit of an animation just to explain how we did this, but using factor analysis, we started to create these clusters of STEM learning venues in our city. When, not surprisingly, when people are asked who's doing STEM learning, they start with, their jobs, colleges, schools, and then restaurants, home, and stores. This is kind of the center of where STEM learning is happening. And then this next group, we thought it was quite fun that the planetarium, library, park, and auto shop all came up as having a lot in common. They tended to be associated with one another as dealing with very similar content types. Then we had the mystical group of museums where natural history, botanic garden, national parks or state parks, as opposed to local parks, all clustered within the museum set. Very similar in terms of the types of STEM learning. And when we say STEM, we weren't asking people about the word STEM. We were asking about science, technology, engineering, or math in order to understand how these groups cluster. So we were asked about each of those categories. And then another cluster emerged, not surprisingly. The zoo and aquarium are very much associated, but not as associated with the Natural History Museum as we had initially thought, and quite distant from the Science Center, which is a universe unto itself. The last part we thought was actually quite humorous is that when we ask people about the type of learning they get at zoos and aquariums, it turns out that the backyard and front yard is the same sort of thing. And so the backyard and front yard cluster with zoo and aquarium is where STEM learning is occurring. So with that study, what we wanted to do is then get a little bit deeper, because we've taken it from science, technology, engineering, and math, and we wanted to see, are there biases that talk about the degree to which topics are salient or relevant? Where is the expertise that zoos and aquariums can put forward in comparison with others in the STEM learning ecology? With that, we did our comparison study with, obviously we had to include the backyard, front yard because it was part of the aquarium and zoo set. But we did want to look at the variation we see between the Botanic Garden, the Natural History Museum, and the Science Center. In effect, the nature space that we were told is a set. And what you're looking at now is a heat map where the darkest color indicates where there is a high expectation for content expertise accorded to the institution. This is the legitimacy or the authority that is afforded to zoos and aquariums. Now, it comes as no surprise that people are going to tell you species names, right? You'll see that sustainability is moderate to low, medicine almost non-existent at an aquarium, but interestingly, it is not atypical for people to think I might hear about that at a zoo or an aquarium. I'm not going to read all of the categories and explain, but the heat map, where it's dark, we're expecting to see the most expertise, and where it's almost white, we're expecting very seldom should I be running into that, or is the authority there. Because this is a webinar for people from across the informal STEM learning world, I wanted to then show you how the heat maps compare from the other sets. So the Science Center is more of a universal. You'll see there's a lot more continuity between the different topics and where the authority is. It is different from what I would expect from a zoo or an aquarium in terms of where the emphasis might be placed and what is common understanding. Natural history museums share quite a bit with the Science Center, but you'll see that the Natural History Museum is much more heavily skewed towards geography. When you think about zoos and aquariums and how much they talk about where animals are in trouble, it's sort of a surprise to see the Natural History Museum is much more intensely focused on geography. For the Botanic Garden, we see a shift that gets a little closer to the zoo or the aquarium in terms of some of the types of content or where the authority and legitimacy lies. And then in the backyard and front yard, we see the sort of blending of those categories and how they look similar. So that's kind of the heat map that shows you what the uniqueness is that is accorded to a place that labels itself a zoo or an aquarium in our society. And so we're calling that the STEM learning ecology, and where I would be looking for more authority or less authority to talk on different topics around, for example, medicine or food or nutrition. So with that, that's a quick preliminary run through our data, and I'm wondering if there are any questions that I can answer about that, and then we'll go back to a larger set of questions for the group.
Yes, we definitely have a few specific questions for you, and some more sort of general implications for across all three of our presenters. So we'll start with some for you, Johnny. Going back to the slide about the gap in trust, did you see a difference between zoos and aquariums? That was earlier in your presentation. So Sean,
Yes,
if you could navigate back to that slide.
Yeah, we didn't put it in this slideshow, but if you look at the moderate middle, you'll see that that the bias for and against zoos and aquariums, we break them out so that aquariums have a little bit more of a favorable breakdown, where the zoo tends to be a little less favorable. It is not a substantial difference. It is significant, but it also, the reason we look at both that and the learning ecology is because it is around topics and types of species and what people think about their care.
Great, thank you.
And then that reinforces prior data from the WASAM 2 study, the Why Zoos and Aquariums Matter 2, where we get into a little bit more detail about some of those things. So at this point, we are validating results that we've been tracking for the last 10 years. Actually, 12 years.
All right, next question. So someone was asking about the trust profiles, where you split it up into those 4 groups. If you could say a little bit more about your 2 categories of environmentalist and conservationist.
The trust profiles. Yeah, so when we looked at where the lack of concern was, you'll see that the environmentalists, when we say environmentalists, we don't just mean the environment in general, but also the environment around me. They're placing some greater emphasis on the attraction experience or the quality of the institution itself as an environment, but they're also pushing just a little bit more toward the interest in the experience, the wildlife agency, and they are dead in the middle of the ethical integrity group, but they're less concerned about individual animals. Everything else seems to have a relationship that looks more systemic, where the conservationists, the purpose of my actual visit is of less concern than the larger systemic work that's going on. And so that's really why we separate the conservationists from the environmentalists. And we fought over these, as I said, we did this workshop with about 30 people to say, you know, why is this significant something? There is a value set difference. And that value set seems to be around whether they care about the place or the purpose. And so we at one point talked about them as mission focused, that the conservationist is focused much more on the conservation of species, whereas the environmentalist is the conservation of systems.
Thank you. And then one more question before we pivot to the whole group.
Here's on, okay, I'm not feeling like the names are the perfect thing. So if anybody's got other suggestions, please email them to me.
All right, and did you have any sense of the types of communication channels that visitors were exposed to, either in their sort of broader life, but also in the zoo or aquarium itself?
We didn't look at the zoo and aquarium. We did do, in part of this work, we did do some preliminary assessment of where people are hearing from the zoo in social media and the newspaper, and it really comes as no surprise. Quite honestly, that turned out to be kind of a difficult thing to sell, because zoos and aquariums are all active on social media. They are all active in the press. They are often referenced in the press, and there tends to be a kind of breakdown around the mission-based work, the advocacy work, and cute animal pictures. And beyond that, I mean, it's a pretty ubiquitous world right now. So there isn't a lot that I can say there. It was difficult to get into the depth of it because there isn't a lot of commentary that you don't expect from the people on either end of the bias spectrum. So a lot of the chatter is around the extremes, not around the moderate middle.
Okay, thank you. All right, so a few questions for our...
And we couldn't find it.
All right, a few questions for our all of our panelists. So we know that you guys are in the middle of this study and still, you know, thinking about things, still some studies to do, but what are you thinking in terms of the types of products you'll create? So in the vein of helping people to apply your research findings, to think about how it can help them in practice, what kinds of things are thinking about creating or doing?
Joe and Martin, do you want me to start?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Go ahead.
Okay, so first of all, Jessica Sickler Consulting is working with the Association of Zoos and Aquariums on a set of learning tools that will include both likely online learning tools as well as some publications that will come out through the Zoo and Aquarium Association. And most of those, I am confident, will also find their way to the CASE website as what we would call practitioner tools. So what are the implications, the workshops around the implications? That is one whole set of training that is based on the Zoos and Aquariums model that started in 2001. Each of our research studies is intended to support the field. So those happen through what AZA has called Zoo School. And then obviously all of us in this team are working on a series of peer-reviewed papers. I think we have 5 or 6 in production right now or in review that we hope will be published very soon, followed by an online presence on the wasam.org website, where we'll be posting those abstracts as the papers come out, and ideally a helpful translation of, so what does this finding mean for your practice? So for example, the trust profiles that I was just presenting, part of that has to do with why it might be important to segment your audience when you're doing any kind of public perception study to see who the loud voices are and where they're placing their priorities, because our groups show where they don't care or where they're putting priorities, but when you put them all together, it gets kind of mushy and you don't really know where the loud voices are that are going to be either objecting or promoting. And so that's why we would suggest that is a utility of having the trust profiles, or the understanding of perception versus trust, in order to look at where you might need to put emphasis in your public communications. Joe and Martin, do you have other tools that you're working on that I forgot to mention.
We had also talked about as a team that we will be trying to get things placed in more popular newsletters like AZA Connect or Aztec Dimensions, so that some of it will come out more toward the practitioner versus the academic in terms of findings. So that's another piece of the profile.
Yeah, I want to second that. It's really important to us that we begin to think and query with practitioners what this might mean in terms of how you apply this. So that is certainly, because it's a research and service to practice grant, a strong component of our work. So you'll see that even when there's academic publications, we want to accompany these with an interpretation that is more useful for practitioners.
As you mentioned that, Martin, the AZA Connect has a section every issue on research summaries, where when something appears in the peer-reviewed literature, a practical summary is placed in Connect, and certainly we are targeting some of our dissemination through that location.
Nice, thank you. So I know you guys did want to thank a few of your partner aquariums and zoos, but we had one more question. Someone mentioned that this is WZAM 3, so part of a much longer body of work. Could you briefly reiterate how WZAM 3 connects to that previous work and how your studies are working together? I think we just, with all the information, needed a reminder of how those things mesh.
Not a problem. Joe, why don't you do WZAM 1? I'll do WZAM 2.
Okay, so WZAM 1 asked the question, what do people get out of a visit? And a little bit of what they bring to the visit. And so we started off, what are the entry and exit points of the visit? And so that was our first framing.
And then the series of tools that came out of that were blended together with WZAM 2. WZAM 2 looked at the initial, what is the social stereotypes and perceptions of zoos and aquariums, and we explored in that project not only the difference between how educators and the general public typify what a zoo experience is and what its authority is, but we also looked at key influentials such as politicians, religious leaders, conservationists around their perceptions of zoos and aquariums and how it shaped the public narrative. It laid the groundwork for the trust. So the best way to describe it is the WZAM 1 looked at what people bring and how prepared were they for the conservation message. And the second one looked at the social narrative. And then this third one, now that we have the work that's going on with looking at the actual behaviors, the more contextual relationships, and the digging into these assigned and legitimacy questions, we're able to get to a much more fine-grained understanding of the social role these places play in society and lifelong learning. And Joe, we've got 3 minutes left, so we probably need to jump straight to you saying thank you, because we have 3 minutes of thank you.
Right. So the first thanks, of course, need to go to the research teams. You'll see a lot of names listed. You probably noticed as we spoke about the intentional overlap in what we asked, and often in ways in which we ask things. We are working closely together. These are not just 3 teams. We are intentionally doing a lot together, and a lot of our findings will come together in some of the work, the publications and learnings that we come forward with. And of course, we also need to thank our advisors, a wonderful group of zoo and aquarium professionals, social scientists, STEM researchers, and evaluators. So that has been a tremendous asset to us to have their advice, and we've used it often and deeply. And then, of course, we need to thank our collaborating zoos and aquariums. With all of the following lists,
10, 15 seconds.
Have been institutions that have hosted or have been very active in gathering data with us. There are monthly asks from New Knowledge that are short asks that then get put together, and a lot of zoos and aquariums involved in that. There are 26 zoos and aquariums that are involved in the Center for Research and Evaluation study, where they have gone out 4 times during the year to gather a lot of data for us. And then, of course, the sites where, and especially the sites where Oregon State University is working so closely with them on doing the reinterpretation to try to figure out how language changes, and then who hosted all of us in our pilot phases. So thank you to our collaborating zoos and aquariums. This was a wonderful experience for all of us. And finally, we'd like to thank the National Science Foundation. WZAM 3 is supported by the National Science Foundation, and we are happy to have them as our sponsor.
Awesome. Well, we are so on time. It's 2:59. Thanks again to our presenters and their entire staff for helping put this webinar together. For all of you on the webinar, in about a week, we'll send you the recording, the slides, and some other unanswered questions that we didn't quite get to. So thanks again for joining today.